The wind screamed across Crooked Bluff, like the voices of the damned driving snow through every crack in the abandoned cabin's walls. Inside, iron clinked against iron, as Mercy Talbot pulled against the chains that bound her wrists to the rusted stove, her swollen belly contracting in waves of agony that made her bite through her own lip to keep from crying out. Blood pooled beneath her on the splintered floor, dark against the pale wood. Her dress, once blue as summer sky, was now torn and stained beyond recognition. The contractions came faster now, each one threatening to tear her apart from the inside, while the memory of Thatch Heller's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes mercy requires suffering, Mrs. Talbot. Sometimes we must break a person to save their soul. Outside, boots crunched through the snow in measured paces. Back and forth. Back and forth. Thatch's shadow passed the frosted window again and again, a black shape against the white storm. Waiting. Watching. Making sure no one would come to witness what he called God's justice. Mercy's scream finally broke free, echoing off the cabin's walls before the wind swallowed it whole. Her baby was coming, whether she was ready or not, whether she lived or died, whether anyone in Crooked Bluff remembered that pregnant women deserved better than chains and abandonment. The shadow stopped pacing. A door creaked open somewhere, then slammed shut again. Thatch's voice carried on the wind low and satisfied. "Won't be long now. Then we'll have our answers." 3 months earlier, Mercy Talbot had been the blacksmith's wife, respected if not beloved, known for her quick wit and refusal to bend her neck to any man's will. At 23, she'd already buried one husband. Thomas fell from his horse one evening, skull cracked against a stone, and the whispers had started before his body was even cold. Crooked Bluff was the kind of town that fed on whispers. Built around a played-out silver mine and sustained by cattle ranchers who needed a place to spend their money, it clung to respectability like a drowning man clutches driftwood. The town's moral center was its white-painted church where Thatch Heller had preached for 5 years with the fervor of a man who believed God spoke directly through his lips. Awful convenient timing, the women murmured over their washing. Young widow with property and no witnesses to the accident. That horse was gentle as a lamb. The men agreed, shaking their heads over their whiskey. Strange thing, a mount like that throwing its rider. But it was Thatch who transformed whispers into gospel truth. From his pulpit he spoke of women who led good men astray of madness that ran in bloodlines like a curse of the devil's own cunning wrapped in feminine form. As the town's preacher and newly appointed deputy sheriff Tobin, having granted him the badge after claiming the position needed a man of moral authority, Thatch wielded both spiritual and legal power with the precision of a surgeon. "I've seen the signs in poor Mercy," he'd told his Sunday congregation, his pale blue eyes never quite meeting anyone's gaze directly. "Grief has fractured her mind. She speaks to shadows, laughs at inappropriate moments, flies into rages over small things. It's a mercy that the Lord hasn't yet blessed her with children given her delicate condition." The congregation nodded gravely, filing away this information for future use. In Crooked Bluff, being labeled as delicate was social death. It meant you couldn't be trusted with important decisions, couldn't be relied upon in crisis, couldn't be believed when you spoke uncomfortable truths. But God, it seemed, had a sense of irony. When Mercy's belly began to swell, Thatch's carefully constructed narrative began to crack. His visits to her cabin became more frequent, his questions more pointed, his demeanor shifting from pastoral concern to something harder and more demanding. "Whose child?" he'd asked during his last official visit, cornering her in her own kitchen while snow began to fall outside. "Thomas has been dead 4 months. You'll tell me whose bastard you carry, or I'll have to investigate your husband's death more thoroughly." Mercy had backed against the wall, her hand instinctively protecting her stomach. "Thomas's child. Conceived before he died, like I told you before. Liar." Thatch's voice was soft, dangerous, and for a moment His mask of righteous concern slipped to reveal something predatory underneath. I know what you are, Mercy. I know what you've done. I know what you'll do if someone doesn't stop you. That night, Mercy had barricaded her door and loaded Thomas's old shotgun. But when they came for her the next morning, it was Sheriff Tobin and 3 men, all armed, all claiming legal authority. The charges were vague, disturbing the peace, moral turpitude, danger to herself and others in her condition. But the chains were real enough. For your own protection, Thatch had said, watching as they locked the manacles around her wrists and secured them to the old stove in this abandoned cabin on Crooked Bluff's outskirts. Until the baby comes, and we can sort out this whole unfortunate business. Can't have you doing something rash in your state of mind. That was a week ago. Since then, her only visitor had been Thatch himself, coming to check that the chains held, that she was still breathing, that his plan was proceeding exactly as he designed. Maddox Boone stumbled through the blizzard like a man already half dead, his coat frozen stiff as armor, his beard white with ice that cracked when he breathed. The storm had caught him on the trail between settlements, and for the past 6 hours, he'd been following what he hoped was the scent of wood smoke on the wind, praying it would lead to shelter before the cold claimed him completely. At 41, Maddox had the weathered look of a man who'd lived through more than his share of troubles. A scar ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a memento from a knife fight in Silver Creek. His right hand was missing 2 fingers, courtesy of a mining accident that had ended his career as a hard rock driller. But it was his eyes that told the real story, gray, as winter sky haunted by memories of all the times he'd walked away, when he should have stayed and fought. The cabin appeared through the snow, like a mirage candlelight, flickering weakly in one frost-covered window. Maddox didn't bother knocking. Courtesy was a luxury he couldn't afford with frostbite creeping up his fingers. The door was unlocked, hanging loose on its hinges, and he pushed inside, expecting to find shelter and maybe a sympathetic ear from whatever homesteader had claim to this remote place. Instead, he found a scene from his worst nightmares. The woman was chained to the cast-iron stove like an animal, her wrists raw and bloody from fighting the manacles. Blood stained her torn dress and pooled beneath her on the splintered floor, and her breathing came in short, sharp gasps that spoke of pain beyond anything a person should endure. But it was her eyes that stopped Maddox, cold, dark brown eyes that looked up at him without surprise, without hope, as if she'd already accepted that no rescue was coming. Jesus Christ, Maddox breathed, and the woman's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. Wrong savior, she whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming. Jesus wouldn't chain a pregnant woman to a stove and leave her to die in labor. The words hit Maddox like a physical blow, dragging up memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Another woman, another time, another place he'd walked away from. Sarah Collins, her name had been begging him to help her get away from her husband's fists and her brother-in-law's wandering hands. Just help me get to the next town, she'd pleaded. I can't make it alone, not with winter coming. But Maddox had been younger then, more concerned with avoiding trouble than confronting it. He'd wished her luck and ridden on, telling himself it wasn't his fight, that she'd figure something out. 2 weeks later, he'd heard she'd been found dead in a canyon, beaten so badly even the scavengers had left her alone. Who did this to you? He asked, already moving toward the stove, examining the chains, with hands that shook from more than just cold. Man named Thatch Heller, Mercy said through gritted teeth. Preacher, deputy, says I'm mad that I killed my husband, that I'm carrying his bastard. Another contraction hit her, and she doubled over, as much as the chains would allow, a sound escaping her throat that was part scream, part sob. Says it's a mercy keeping me here, protecting the town from my influence. Maddox tested the chains. They were new, heavy, secured with a padlock that would take dynamite to break. But the stove was old, its legs rusted, its mortar connections crumbling. He braced himself against the wall and kicked hard at the base, feeling the structure shift under the impact. What are you doing?" Mercy gasped, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope. "Getting you free." Another kick. The stove shifted mortar dust, raining down. "Sarah Collins died alone because no one would help her. You're not dying the same way." "You don't understand," Mercy said urgently, trying to grab his arm as another contraction racked her body. "If he finds you here, if Thatch thinks you're the father, or that you're helping me escape, he'll kill you. He'll say you attacked an officer, that you were trying to kidnap me. Nobody will question his word. Let him come." Maddox kicked again, and one of the stove's legs cracked audibly. "I'm done walking away from fights that matter." With a final decisive kick, the stove's supports gave way completely. The iron structure tilted sideways, and the chain went slack enough for Mercy to slip her hands free, leaving the manacles dangling empty. She collapsed the moment she was free, her body racked with exhaustion and pain. But her eyes, those dark brown eyes, blazed with something fierce and unbroken. "Thank you," she whispered, and Maddox heard in those two words everything Sarah Collins had never gotten the chance to say. Freedom from the chains was only the beginning. Mercy collapsed the moment the iron was off her wrists, her body racked with contractions that came every few minutes now. Blood loss had left her weak and pale, and Maddox could see fever building behind her eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Hospital," he said, trying to lift her gently. "Town doctor. Someone who knows about delivering babies." "No." Mercy grabbed his arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "Thatch controls Doc Morrison, controls Sheriff Tobin. They'll say you kidnapped me, that you're the father, that you drove me mad with your influence." Her voice dropped to a desperate whisper. "Every time someone tries to help me, he finds a way to use it against them. That's how he works. That's how he's always worked." Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and through the frost-glazed window, Maddox could see the storm intensifying. Even if there was a doctor in town willing to help, which seemed unlikely given what Mercy had told him, no one was traveling anywhere in this weather. The snow was already knee-deep and rising, and the temperature was dropping fast enough to kill a man in minutes. "And we do this here," he said simply, though the words tasted like ashes in his mouth. What did he know about delivering babies? What did he know about anything that might save this woman's life? "You don't understand." Mercy's eyes were wide with pain and terror. "I've been chained here for days. Haven't eaten more than scraps. Haven't slept. Haven't been able to clean myself or tend to the bleeding. I don't know if the baby's still alive. I don't know if I'm strong enough to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Maddox heard the unspoken words, "strong enough to survive." He looked around the cabin with new eyes, cataloging what they had to work with. It was barely furnished, a single bed with a straw mattress, a rough wooden table, 2 rickety chairs, the now broken stove. No medical supplies, no clean water except what he could melt from snow, nothing that might help with a difficult birth. The fireplace was cold, the woodpile nearly empty, and the wind was finding every gap in the walls, making the temperature inside barely warmer than outside. But they were alive, and they were together, and that was more than Sarah Collins had ever gotten. "You're not alone anymore," he said quietly, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "We'll figure it out as we go." Maddox found a hatchet by the door and went outside into the storm, chopping frozen wood from the cabin's outer walls and the collapsed lean-to behind the building. The cold cut through his coat like knives, and his injured hand cramped around the hatchet handle. But he kept working until he had enough fuel to last through the night. When he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots and shaking ice from his beard, he found Mercy unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandages he'd wrapped around her wrists, and more blood stained the bed where she lay. Maddox built up the fire until the cabin was warm melted snow in a battered pot for clean water, and tore his own shirt into strips for fresh bandages. Then he sat beside Mercy's bed and waited, listening to the storm rage outside and praying to whatever God might be listening that he wouldn't fail another woman who needed his help. But as the hours passed and Mercy's condition seemed to worsen rather than improve, Maddox began to understand that good intentions and determination might not be enough. The baby was coming whether he was ready or not, and Mercy was growing weaker with each passing contraction. Mercy drifted in and out of consciousness through the long night, sometimes lucid enough to grip Maddox's hand during contractions, sometimes delirious with fever and pain. In her clearer moments, she told him about Thomas, about their brief marriage, and his sudden suspicious death. He wasn't a perfect man. She whispered, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cabin's chill. Drank too much when the work was slow, lost his temper when things went wrong. But he never raised a hand to me, never looked at me the way Thatch does. "What way is that?" Maddox asked, mopping her face with a damp cloth made from his torn shirt. Like he owns me already. Like I'm something to be controlled, broken, reshaped into what he wants. Another contraction hit, and she gripped his hand until her knuckles went white and his fingers ached. Started before Thomas died. Started the day I came to town as Thomas's bride. Between her gasps of pain and exhaustion, the story emerged like blood from a wound. Thatch Heller had been Crooked Bluff's preacher for 5 years, arriving with impeccable credentials and a silver tongue that could make sinners weep with repentance. He was unmarried, devoted to his calling, respected by all as a man who'd given up worldly pleasures to serve God and community. But from the moment Mercy arrived as Thomas's new bride, Thatch's attention had been unwelcome, persistent, and increasingly threatening. Cornered me after my first Sunday service. She said, her voice barely above a whisper. Told me he was concerned about my soul, about the influence I might have on Thomas. Said some women brought out the devil in good men, made them forget their duties to God and community. She laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the firelit cabin. When I told Thomas, he said I was imagining things. Said Thatch was just being pastoral, looking out for the spiritual welfare of his flock. But the attention had escalated steadily. Late-night visits when Thomas was away on business. Letters slipped under her door that spoke of salvation and submission in language that made her skin crawl. A hand that lingered too long when passing the communion cup. And always the underlying threat, Thatch's position in the community, his badge, his ability to make life very difficult for anyone who crossed him. After Thomas died, it got worse. Mercy continued, her voice growing stronger as anger overcame pain. He'd come by every day supposedly to check on my welfare. Brought food, firewood, always with that smile, always talking about how worried he was about me. How grief could drive a woman to madness if she wasn't properly guided and protected. The baby kicked hard, and Mercy cried out, her body arching with pain. When the contraction passed, she looked at Maddox with desperate, fever-bright eyes. "Promise me something," she said. "If I don't make it through this, if something happens to me, don't let him have my baby. Don't let him raise my child to be another weapon in his war against anyone who won't submit." "You're going to make it," Maddox said firmly, though uncertainty gnawed at his gut like hunger. "Promise me," she insisted, her grip on his hand tightening. He looked into her eyes and saw Sarah Collins there. Saw every woman he'd failed to help every time he'd walked away from trouble because it wasn't his fight. "I promise. But you're going to be fine. Both of you are going to be fine." But as the night wore on and Mercy's condition seemed to worsen rather than improve, Maddox began to doubt his own words. She was losing too much blood, the contractions weren't progressing the way they should, and her fever was climbing steadily. Worst of all, he could hear voices outside, men calling to each other through the storm, getting closer with each passing hour. "He's coming," Mercy whispered, her eyes fixed on the frost-covered window. "Thatch. He's been waiting for me to die quietly, but something's wrong. Something's taking too long for his schedule. Maddox moved to the window and peered out through the ice. Dark shapes moved through the snow, at least 4 men with lanterns, heading straight for the cabin. One of them was tall and thin, moving with the confident stride of a man who owned everything he surveyed. "Can you travel?" Maddox asked urgently, though he already knew the answer. Mercy tried to sit up and immediately collapsed back down, gasping with pain and exhaustion. "No. Baby's coming now. Can't stop it even if I wanted to." The voices were getting closer, and Maddox could make out individual words now. "Check the perimeter. No witnesses. Clean this up once and for all." Maddox checked his gun, an old Colt revolver with 5 bullets left. Not much against 4 armed men, but better than nothing. He also had his knife, Thomas's shotgun that Mercy had mentioned, and the element of surprise. If he was going to make a stand, it would have to be here and now. "Whatever happens," he told Mercy, leaving the knife within her reach, "don't let them take you alive. Don't let them take the baby." She nodded her hand, moving to the blade with grim determination. Outside, boots crunched through the snow in a deliberate pattern surrounding the cabin. Thatch Heller's voice carried clearly on the wind, calm and assured. "Gentlemen, we're here to help a poor, deranged woman who's gotten herself into an unfortunate situation. Whatever we find in there, remember that we're acting in the community's best interest. Sometimes mercy requires unpleasant decisions." The knock on the door came soft and hesitant. Nothing like what Maddox had expected from armed men on a mission of violence. He moved to the window again and saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't Thatch and his men outside. It was a boy, maybe 16 years old, leading a small group of townspeople through the storm. "Mrs. Talbot." The boy called out, his young voice cracking with nervousness and determination. "Ma'am, it's Ethan Blackwood. My mother sent me. We saw the smoke from your chimney, and we know what's been done to you." Maddox looked at Mercy, who had gone pale with shock and terror. "It's a trap," she whispered, her eyes wide with panic. "Has to be. No one comes out here willingly. No one in Crooked Bluff cares what happens to me." But through the window, Maddox could see the group more clearly now. An older woman with graying hair and a determined expression, her face creased with worry and righteous anger. A middle-aged man with a doctor's bag clutched in his hands. 2 other women, both looking nervous but resolute. And the boy Ethan standing at the front of the group with his shoulders squared like he was ready for the fight of his life. "We know you're in there, Mrs. Talbot." The older woman called out, her voice carrying clearly over the wind. "We know what they did to you. We know about the chains, about the lies, about everything Thatch Heller has been doing in this town's name." "How?" Mercy whispered, then her eyes went wide with recognition and something that might have been hope. "Ethan. He works at Henderson's stable. He's seen—" She gripped Maddox's arm with sudden urgency. 3 days ago, when Thatch came to check on me, Ethan was there in the barn next door, mucking stalls. He saw Thatch hit me when I wouldn't tell him what he wanted to hear. Saw him chain me back up when I tried to get away. The revelation hit Maddox like a lightning strike. These people hadn't come to help Thatch, they'd come to help Mercy. Despite the storm, despite the risk, despite years of being told to mind their own business and trust their betters, a handful of Crooked Bluff citizens had finally decided that some things were more important than keeping quiet. "My mother's a midwife." Ethan called out, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Best in 3 counties. Doc Morrison's here too, and Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Lee from the church auxiliary. Please, Mrs. Talbot, let us help you." But even as relief flooded through Maddox, he heard something else in the distance. Another group of voices, harder and more purposeful, getting closer through the storm. Thatch and his men, drawn by the smoke and the voices, coming to finish what they'd started. Maddox made his decision. He unbarred the door and pulled it open, revealing the small group of would-be rescuers. They looked cold and frightened, but their eyes blazed with determination and barely controlled fury. "Thank God," the older woman, Ethan's mother, breathed when she saw Mercy on the bed. She pushed past Maddox without ceremony, her experienced hands already assessing the situation. "Sarah Blackwood, I've delivered more babies than I can count, and I've never lost a mother yet." She took one look at Mercy's condition and turned to the others with crisp authority. "Doc Morrison, she's lost too much blood, and the fever's setting in. We need to move fast. Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Lee, heat water and find clean cloth." Ethan watched the door and the windows, but as the group mobilized around Mercy like a well-trained team, Ethan grabbed Maddox's arm with urgent desperation. "Thatch is coming," he said in a harsh whisper. "We saw his men heading this way when we left town. He's got Sheriff Tobin and at least 3 deputies all armed, all convinced they're hunting a dangerous criminal." "How did you know to come here?" Maddox asked. Ethan's young face hardened with an anger that belonged on someone much older. "Because I saw what he did to her, and because my mother remembers what happened to the last woman who crossed Thatch Heller. Rebecca Stern. They found her in the river 3 years ago, said she drowned herself in despair over her sins. But..." He shook his head, his hands clenched into fists. "Thatch had been visiting her too. Pastoral care, he called it. Helping her deal with her grief after her husband died." The truth crashed over Maddox like an avalanche. Thatch hadn't just chained Mercy up as punishment for imagined crimes, he'd done this before. Maybe more than once. A pattern of control, isolation, and murder, all hidden behind the facade of moral authority and community protection. "How many?" Maddox asked quietly, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "How many what? How many women has he killed?" Ethan looked out at the storm, his young face etched with grief and rage. "We're not sure. But Rebecca makes 2 that we know of. And there was talk about others women who left town suddenly or died in accidents. But nobody wanted to ask questions. Nobody wanted to believe that our preacher, our deputy, could be..." He couldn't finish the sentence. From outside came the sound of horses' hooves and men's voices getting closer with each passing second. Thatch Heller was coming to finish his work, and this time he wouldn't be content with just letting Mercy die slowly. This time there were witnesses to eliminate. Thatch arrived with Sheriff Tobin and 3 deputies just as Sarah Blackwood was helping Mercy through the most difficult stage of labor. The preacher kicked open the cabin door without bothering to knock, his pale blue eyes taking in the scene with cold calculation and barely suppressed rage. "Well, well," he said softly, his voice carrying the authority of the pulpit and the menace of the badge. "What have we here? A kidnapper, several trespassers, and a mad woman giving birth to God knows whose bastard." His hand rested casually on the butt of his gun, but Maddox could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as he realized his careful plan had gone completely awry. "Sheriff, I believe we have a situation that requires immediate and decisive intervention." Sheriff Tobin looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting between Thatch and the people gathered around Mercy's bed. He was a weak man, Maddox realized, the kind who followed orders without asking questions, as long as someone else was willing to take responsibility for the consequences. "No, now Thatch," the sheriff said slowly, his voice uncertain. "Maybe we should think about this situation more carefully. These folks look like they're just trying to help a woman in childbirth." "Help?" Thatch's voice rose with righteous indignation, and for a moment his mask of calm authority slipped to reveal the fury underneath. "They're interfering with official business, Sheriff. That woman is in protective custody for her own welfare and the community's safety. And this man..." He pointed at Maddox with a finger that shook slightly. "Is clearly the one who impregnated her and drove her to madness. Look at the evidence. He's freed her from her restraints, isolated her from proper medical care, and now he's using these well-meaning but misguided people to create a distraction while he attempts to escape justice. Doc Morrison looked up from where he was helping Sarah with the delivery. His weathered face creased with disgust and disbelief. Deputy Heller, this woman has been brutally mistreated. She's been chained like an animal deprived of food and medical care, left to die in childbirth. Whatever you think she's done, this isn't justice, it's torture. Dr. Morrison. Thatch interrupted smoothly, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used for disagreeable parishioners. I'm afraid your medical expertise doesn't extend to psychiatric evaluation. Mrs. Talbot is clearly delusional, probably dangerous to herself and others, and this man has obviously manipulated her condition for his own twisted purposes. The safety of the community must come first. But it was Sarah Blackwood who spoke up from beside Mercy's bed, her voice cutting through the cabin like a blade drawn from its sheath. If she's so dangerous, Thatch, why wasn't she given a trial? Why wasn't she evaluated by an actual psychiatrist instead of being chained up like a rabid dog? And why are you so eager to silence anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions? The cabin fell silent except for Mercy's labored breathing and the howl of wind outside. The townspeople looked at each other uncertainly, years of ingrained deference to authority warring with what they could see with their own eyes, a woman in chains, blood on the floor, and a man with a badge who seemed more concerned with maintaining control than seeking truth. Then Ethan stepped forward, his young voice steady and clear despite the tremor in his hands. No, I beg your pardon. Thatch said, his pale eyes fixing on the boy with the intensity of a predator selecting prey. I said no. Ethan repeated, standing straighter despite the obvious fear in his eyes. I saw you hit her, Deputy Heller, 3 days ago in Henderson's stable yard. She was chained up and helpless, and you hit her across the face because she wouldn't answer your questions the way you wanted. Then you chained her back up and told her that suffering was good for the soul. Thatch's mask of righteous authority slipped completely for just a moment, revealing something cold and vicious and utterly without mercy. Boy, you're obviously confused by what you think you saw. Stress and fear can play tricks on a young mind. I'm sure when you've had time to reflect calmly, I'm thinking plenty clear. Ethan interrupted, his voice growing stronger with each word. Clear enough to remember Rebecca Stern. Clear enough to remember how you visited her every week before she accidentally drowned herself. Clear enough to wonder what really happened to her and to Martha Henley before her and to any other woman in this town who didn't submit to your version of godliness. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sheriff Tobin looked shocked, his hand moving instinctively away from his gun. The deputies exchanged uncertain glances, clearly hearing these accusations for the first time. And Thatch's hand moved closer to his weapon, his pale eyes burning with barely controlled rage. That's enough, the preacher said quietly, his voice deadly calm. Sheriff, arrest them all. Conspiracy, obstruction of justice, interfering with an officer in the performance of his duties. We'll sort out the specific charges later, but right now, we need to restore order and remove these people from a dangerous situation. But before anyone could move, Mercy's scream filled the cabin, raw and primal and desperate, the sound of a woman fighting for her life and her child's future. Sarah Blackwood looked up with tears streaming down her face. The baby's coming now, she said urgently. Right now. She needs to push, and she needs everyone here to stop threatening her and let her do what she needs to do. For a moment, the entire cabin held its breath. Then Thatch drew his gun and pointed it directly at the newborn's head as Sarah guided the child into the world. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare painted in blood and firelight. As Mercy bore down with the final desperate push of labor, as Sarah Blackwood guided the baby into the world with hands that shook from more than just cold, Thatch Heller drew his gun and pointed it directly at the newborn's head. "Now that child is evidence," he said, his voice deadly calm, despite the madness blazing in his pale eyes. "Evidence of Mrs. Talbot's moral corruption and mental instability. It cannot be allowed to live and spread its mother's taint through this community." "You're talking about murdering a baby," Doc Morrison said, his voice shaking with horror and disbelief. "I'm talking about protecting this town from the spawn of madness and sin." Thatch snarled, his careful facade finally crumbling completely. This woman seduced and murdered her husband. She corrupted this drifter and used him to break free from lawful custody. And now she's brought another bastard into the world to continue her work of destruction. Someone needs to take responsibility for cleaning up this mess before it spreads any further. But as Thatch spoke, something unexpected happened. Deputy Marcus Webb, who had stood silently behind the sheriff throughout the confrontation, stepped forward and placed his hand on Thatch's gun arm. "No," Webb said quietly. "This ends here." Thatch spun toward the deputy, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "Marcus, what are you doing? Stand down immediately. That's an order. I don't take orders from you anymore." Webb said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I've been watching you, Thatch. Watching and documenting and waiting for enough evidence to bring you down. Rebecca Stern didn't kill herself. I saw the bruises on her body before you had Doc Morrison sign the death certificate. Martha Henley didn't die in an accident. I found witnesses who saw you arguing with her the night she disappeared. And I've been keeping detailed records of every time you abused your authority, every woman you've threatened, every crime you've committed in the name of moral purity." The revelation hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Deputy Webb reached into his coat and pulled out a thick folder, its pages filled with dates, names, and witness statements. 2 years of evidence. Webb continued, his eyes never leaving Thatch's face. 2 years of watching you destroy innocent women while hiding behind your badge and your Bible. I've been waiting for you to make a mistake big enough to bring you down permanently, and chaining a pregnant woman to a stove while plotting to murder her child definitely qualifies. Thatch's face contorted with rage and desperation. "You have no authority here, Marcus. I'm your superior officer appointed by the county. You're a murderer and a fraud." Webb interrupted, drawing his own gun and pointing it at Thatch's chest. "And your authority ends right now." For a moment, the cabin balanced on a knife's edge. Then Thatch made his choice. Instead of surrendering, instead of accepting that his reign of terror was over, he lunged forward toward the baby in Sarah's arms, his gun swinging toward the helpless infant. "If I can't have order, I'll have justice," he roared. Everything happened at once. Maddox, despite his wounded shoulder, threw himself at Thatch from the side. Deputy Webb fired his bullet, taking Thatch in the arm and spinning him around. Ethan grabbed a piece of firewood and swung it at Thatch's legs, sending the preacher stumbling backward. But Thatch, wounded and desperate, wasn't finished. He pulled a hidden knife from his boot and slashed wildly at anyone within reach. The blade caught Maddox across the ribs, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding freely. "This is your mercy," Maddox roared, grappling with Thatch despite his wounds, blood streaming down his side. "Chaining pregnant women and murdering babies, is this what you call God's work?" The two men crashed through the cabin door into the howling storm outside, rolling and fighting in the deep snow. Thatch clawed at Maddox's throat while Maddox tried to pin the preacher's knife hand, both men's blood staining the white ground, black in the moonlight. Behind them, the cabin erupted in controlled chaos. Sheriff Tobin shouted orders that no one followed, the remaining deputies looked around uncertainly, and the townspeople pressed against the walls as Sarah Blackwood worked frantically to save both mother and child. "The baby's not breathing," Sarah cried out desperately. "Doc, I need help." Doc Morrison abandoned the fight outside and rushed to Sarah's side, his experienced hands working to clear the infant's airway. For terrifying seconds that stretched like hours, then the only sound was the wind and the struggle outside. Then suddenly, A thin cry pierced the air, weak but unmistakably alive. "She's breathing." Sarah sobbed, wrapping the baby in clean cloth. "She's alive." Outside, Maddox managed to slam Thatch's head into the frozen ground, hard enough to daze him. The preacher's knife went flying into the darkness, and Maddox pinned him face down in the snow. "Now look at him," Maddox roared at the crowd of witnesses gathering in the doorway. "All of you look at what your moral authority really is." And they did look. They saw Thatch Heller, their trusted preacher and deputy, lying bloodied in the snow with murder in his eyes, and the stench of corruption surrounding him like a shroud. They saw Maddox wounded and exhausted, but victorious, standing over the man who had terrorized their town for years. They saw Deputy Webb with his folder of evidence, Doc Morrison tending to a newborn baby, and Sarah Blackwood helping a brutalized woman hold her child for the first time. Most importantly, they saw Mercy Talbot herself alive, defiant, and cradling her daughter with tears of joy streaming down her face. "He told us she was mad," one of the remaining deputies said slowly, his voice hollow with realization. "Told us she was dangerous," whispered Mrs. Patterson. "But look at her," said Mrs. Lee, her voice breaking. "Look at what was done to her in our name." Falling action. The aftermath played out like the slow unwinding of a terrible knot. Sheriff Tobin, faced with undeniable evidence of Thatch's crimes and his own shameful complicity, placed the preacher under arrest for attempted murder assault, unlawful imprisonment, and abuse of authority. The charges would eventually expand to include the murders of Rebecca Stern and Martha Henley. When Deputy Webb's evidence was fully examined, Doc Morrison worked through the night, tending to Maddox's wounds, while Sarah Blackwood cared for both Mercy and baby Emma, named for Sarah's own grandmother, who had been a midwife before her. The cabin, once a place of torment and despair, became something approaching sanctuary, as the townspeople worked together to make Mercy and her daughter warm and comfortable. But the healing wasn't universal or immediate. When word spread through Crooked Bluff about what had really happened, the town split into bitter factions. Some residents expressed genuine shame and horror at what had been done in their name, volunteering to help repair Mercy's cabin and ensure she had everything needed for her recovery. Others, uncomfortable with having their moral authority exposed as a fraud and their own complicity revealed, muttered that Mercy had brought trouble on herself, that things had been simpler and better when people minded their own business and trusted their betters. Change comes slow and hard. Sarah Blackwood told Maddox as he recovered in her house over the following weeks. Some folks would rather believe a comfortable lie than face an uncomfortable truth, even when the truth is staring them in the face. Maddox nodded, understanding all too well. His shoulder was healing, though it would never regain full strength, and the knife wound across his ribs had left another scar to add to his collection. More importantly, he'd found something he hadn't known. He was searching for a purpose beyond just surviving from one day to the next. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked him one morning as he sat by her kitchen window, watching Mercy play with baby Emma in the yard outside. Maddox considered the question carefully. "Stay, I think. For a while, anyway. Somebody needs to make sure no one bothers her, that she gets a fair chance to build a life for herself and Emma. And after that we'll see." Deputy Webb mentioned there might be other places that need help. Other women like Rebecca Stern and Martha Henley who don't have anyone watching out for them. He touched the scar on his face absently. "I've spent enough years walking away from fights that mattered. Time to start walking toward them instead." 3 weeks after the confrontation in the blizzard, Thatch Heller was transferred to the county seat for trial. The wagon carrying him passed through Crooked Bluff just after dawn, and a small crowd gathered to watch their former preacher being taken away in the same chains he had used to torture others. As the wagon disappeared into the distance, Ethan Blackwood found Maddox sitting on his mother's porch, watching the sunrise paint the mountains red and gold. "Think he'll hang?" the boy asked. "Probably," Maddox said. Though men like him have a way of talking themselves out of trouble. Money changes hands, witnesses disappear, stories get confused in the telling. Not this time, Ethan said with fierce determination. Too many people saw. Too many people know the truth now. Deputy Webb's got enough evidence to hang him twice over. Maddox hoped the boy was right, but he'd seen enough of the world to know that justice and what actually happened weren't always the same thing. Still, Thatch was gone, his power broken, his mask torn away for all to see. That was something, at least. You did good that night, Maddox told Ethan. Took real courage to stand up to him the way you did. Ethan shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. My mother always said the only thing worse than being hurt by bad people is being ignored by good people. Figured it was time to stop ignoring and start acting. Wise woman, Maddox thought. The kind of wisdom that might actually make a difference if enough people had the courage to listen and act on it. 6 months later, Mercy Talbot walked into Crooked Bluff's general store, carrying her daughter Emma and holding her head high. The store fell silent as she entered conversations, stopping mid-sentence eyes, following her every movement with a mixture of curiosity, shame, and lingering hostility. She'd regained her strength, and more motherhood had given her a fierce protectiveness that burned in her dark eyes like forge fire. The baby was healthy and beautiful, with dark curls that caught the light and a smile that even the sourest hearts found difficult to resist. More importantly, Mercy herself had found her voice and her purpose. Mrs. Patterson, Mercy said to the store owner's wife, her tone polite but firm, I need flour, sugar coffee beans, and cotton fabric for baby clothes. And I'll pay cash, same as anyone else. Mrs. Patterson, a middle-aged woman who had spent years echoing Thatch's sermons about moral purity and female submission, looked uncomfortable but nodded quickly. Of course, Mrs. Talbot. Right away, as Mercy conducted her business with quiet dignity, other customers drifted in and out of the store. Some nodded politely, others pretended she didn't exist. And a few brave souls actually spoke to her directly, asking about Emma's health, commenting on the weather, treating her like a normal member of the community rather than a pariah to be shunned. When Mercy finished her shopping and turned to leave, she found her path blocked by a group of women she recognized, wives of prominent citizens, pillars of the community. The kind of people who had always looked through her before, as if she were invisible. Mrs. Talbot, said Eleanor Hutchins, the banker's wife, her voice carefully controlled. We wanted to speak with you. Mercy shifted Emma to her other arm, ready for another confrontation or perhaps a demand that she leave town for the comfort of others. Speak away. We wanted to apologize. Eleanor said the words seeming to cost her considerable effort. For what was done to you. For what we allowed to happen through our silence and our willingness to look the other way. The store went completely silent. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing. Apologies don't undo chains, Mercy said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the stillness. Don't heal scars. Don't bring back the dead women who suffered before me. No, agreed Margaret Foster, the mayor's wife, her eyes bright with unshed tears. They don't. But maybe they're a beginning, a first step toward something better. Mercy studied the faces arrayed before her, women who had crossed the street to avoid her, who had whispered about her behind their hands, who had stood silent while she was chained and left to die. Now they looked ashamed, uncertain, desperate for some kind of absolution that only she could grant. A beginning toward what, Mercy asked? Toward making sure it never happens again, Eleanor said firmly. We've been talking, some of us, about forming an organization to help women who find themselves in dangerous situations, to make sure they have somewhere to turn, someone to speak for them when they can't speak for themselves. And who would run this organization? Mercy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The women exchanged glances, and finally Margaret stepped forward. We were hoping you would. You've survived what we only watched happen. You have the moral authority that the rest of us lost through our cowardice." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Mercy looked at these women, some sincere in their desire to help others, perhaps more interested in easing their own guilt, and felt the weight of choice settle on her shoulders like a familiar burden. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "But if I do this, it won't be about making anyone feel better about the past. It'll be about preventing future tragedies and helping women who need real support, not just prayers and platitudes." "We understand," Eleanor said quickly. "Whatever you decide, whatever you need, we'll support you." As Mercy left the store, she found Maddox waiting outside, leaning against a hitching post, with his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. His right arm still hung slightly crooked from his wounds, but his eyes were alert and watchful, as always. "How'd it go?" he asked, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the edge of town. "They want to form an organization," Mercy said, adjusting Emma's blanket against the cool breeze. "Help women in trouble. Want me to run it?" "What do you think?" "I think organizations can be where good intentions go to die," Mercy said thoughtfully. "But I also think that sometimes making noise is more important than making progress. Sometimes the point is to make people uncomfortable, to make sure they can't pretend they don't see what's happening right in front of them." They walked together past the church, where a new preacher now gave sermons about actual forgiveness and redemption, rather than control and submission, past the sheriff's office, where Deputy Webb had been promoted to sheriff and was slowly rebuilding the department's reputation for honest law enforcement. "Thatch's execution is scheduled for next week," Maddox said quietly. "I know. I plan to be there. You sure you want to watch?" Mercy stopped walking and looked back at Crooked Bluff, at the town that had chained her and left her to die, that was now awkwardly trying to make amends. "I need to see it finished. Need to know for certain that he can never hurt another woman the way he hurt Rebecca and Martha and me." As they reached Mercy's cabin, now fully repaired and expanded with help from Ethan and several other townspeople who had found their consciences, she noticed something new waiting on her doorstep. A small wooden cradle beautifully carved with a note attached. "For Emma." The note read, "From the women of Crooked Bluff, who should have acted sooner, but promised to do better in the future." Mercy ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling the love and craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. It was beautiful, practical, and most importantly, it was an acknowledgement that Emma belonged in this community, that she had a right to grow up here, safely and happily. "Maybe organizations aren't where good intentions go to die," Mercy said softly. "Maybe they're where intentions learn to become actions." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky the color of blood and gold, Mercy sat on her porch, nursing Emma, while Maddox worked in the garden he'd planted behind the cabin. In the distance, smoke rose from the chimneys of Crooked Bluff, and the sound of children playing carried on the wind. It wasn't forgiveness. Mercy would never forgive what had been done to her, and she would never forget the women who had died before her. But it was something else, something harder to name, but perhaps more valuable. A kind of peace that came not from forgetting the past, but from refusing to let it define the future. When Emma finished nursing and drifted off to sleep in her new cradle, Mercy spoke into the gathering darkness, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "If you won't hear me now, your daughters will tell it later. No more chains, no more silence, no more looking away while women suffer and die." And in the town below, in houses where women sat by their windows and wondered what kind of world they were leaving their children, those words were heard and remembered and passed along like seeds carried on the wind. The story of Mercy Talbot and the night she refused to die quietly became the story Crooked Bluff told about itself, not the comfortable lie of moral authority and divine justice, but the harder truth about what happened when good people stayed silent and evil people claimed to speak for God. Some stories end with justice served and villains punished. Some end with revenge extracted and scores settled. This one ended with something rarer and more dangerous, the truth spoken aloud by a woman who had survived the worst humanity could offer and emerged stronger, refusing to be buried or forgotten. Thatch Heller was hanged on a cold morning in November, his last words. A rambling condemnation of the town that had rejected his version of salvation. By then, Mercy's women's organization had helped 5 women leave abusive situations, and Maddox had begun corresponding with lawmen in neighboring counties about other cases that might benefit from investigation. The chains were gone. The cabin was rebuilt. And Emma Talbot grew up hearing the story of the night her mother refused to die in someone else's darkness. She learned that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was refuse to be silent when silence meant allowing evil to flourish. And in Crooked Bluff, no woman was ever chained again. The town's new motto, carved into a stone marker beside the church, read simply, "Speak truth. Protect the innocent. Never look away." It was signed, "In memory of Rebecca Stern, Martha Henley, and all the women whose voices were silenced. May their daughters speak louder."